Cristina Elisabet Fernández de Kirchner. Born February 19, 1953, known as Cristina Kirchner and often referred by her initials CFK, is the 52nd and current President of Argentina and widow of former President kɾisˈtina Kirchner. She is the second woman to serve as President of Argentina, the first directly elected female president and the first woman re-elected. A Justicialist, Fernández served one term as national deputy and 3 terms as national senator for both Santa Cruz and Buenos Aires provinces. A native of La Plata, Buenos Aires Province, Fernández is a graduate of the National University of La Plata. She met her husband during her studies, and they moved to Santa Cruz to work as lawyers. In May 1991, she was elected to the provincial legislature. Between 1995 and 2007, she was repeatedly elected to the Argentine National Congress, both as a national deputy and national senator. During Kirchner's presidency she acted as First Lady. Fernández was chosen as the Front for Victory presidential candidate in 2007. In the October 2007 general election she obtained 45.3% of the vote and a 22% lead over her nearest rival, avoiding a runoff election. She was inaugurated on December 10, 2007, and was re-elected to a second term in the first round of the October 2011 general election, with 54.1% and 37.3% over the next candidate, Hermes Binmer. Critics of Kirchner's administration charged it with corruption, crony capitalism, falsification of public statistics, harassment of Argentina's independent media and use of the tax agency as a censorship tool. Personal life: Fernández was born on February 19, 1953 in Tolosa, a suburb west of La Plata, Buenos Aires Province. She is the daughter of Eduardo Fernández, a bus driver, and Ofelia Esther Wilhelm. She studied law at the National University of La Plata during the 1970s and became active in the Peronist youth. In 1973, during her studies there, she met her future spouse, k'r Kirchner. They were married on May 9, 1975, and had 2 children, Máximo and Florencia. k'r Kirchner died on October 27, 2010 after suffering a heart attack. Health: on December 27, 2011, presidential spokesman Alfredo Scoxamaro announced that Fernández had been diagnosed with thyroid cancer on December 22 and that she would undergo surgery on January 4, 2012. However, it was later released that she had been misdiagnosed and did not have cancer. On October 5, 2013, doctors ordered Fernández to rest for a month after they found blood on her brain, due to a head injury she received on August 8, 2012. Fernández was readmitted to hospital and had successful surgery on October 8, 2013 to remove blood covering her brain. Political career: along with k'r Kirchner, Cristina sympathized with the Peronist youth during her university studies. However, the two never joined Montoneros, nor engaged in any notable political activism during that time. When Isabel Piracuben was deposed by the 1976 Argentine coup d'état, they left La Plata for Rio Gallegos and worked as lawyers. Cristina began her political career in the late 1980s when she was elected to the Santa Cruz provincial legislature in 1989, a position to which she was re-elected in 1993. In 1995, Fernández was elected to represent Santa Cruz in the Senate. She was elected to the Chamber of Deputies in 1997 and returned to the Senate in 2001. Fernández helped with her husband's successful campaign for the presidency in 2003, but without making joint public appearances. In April 27, 2003 presidential election first round, former President Carlos Saúl Menem won the greatest number of votes, but failed to get the votes necessary to win an overall majority. A second-round runoff vote between Menem and runner-up k'r Kirchner was scheduled for May 18. Feeling certain that he was about to face a sound electoral defeat, Menem decided to withdraw his candidacy, thus automatically making Kirchner the new president, with 22% of the votes. This was the lowest number in the history of the country. During her husband's term, Fernández de Kirchner was First Lady of the country. In that role, she worked as an itinerant ambassador for his government. Her highly combative speech style polarized Argentine politics, recalling the style of Eva Pera Cubden. Although she repeatedly rejected the comparison later, Fernández de Kirchner once said in an interview that she identified herself with the Evita of the hair in a bun and the clenched fist before a microphone more than with the miraculous Eva of her mother's time, who had come to bring work and the right to vote for women. At the October 2005 legislative elections, Fernández de Kirchner was her party's main candidate for senator in the province of Buenos Aires district. She ran a heated campaign against Hilda González de Duhalde. They were the wives of the sitting president K'r de Kirchner and the former president Eduardo Duhalde. Election to presidency of Argentina. With Fernández leading all the pre-election polls by a wide margin, her challengers were trying to force her into a runoff. A candidate needs either more than 45% of the vote, or 40% of the vote and a lead of more than 10 percentage points over the nearest rival, to win outright without a runoff. She won the election decisively in the first round with nearly 45% of the vote, followed by 23% for Elisabet and 17% for former Economy Minister Roberto Lavagna. Kirchner was popular among the suburban working class and the rural poor, while Kirchner and Lavagna both received more support from the urban middle class. Kirchner lost the election in the large cities of Buenos Aires and Rosario. On November 14 the president-elect announced the names of her new cabinet, which was sworn in on December 10. Of the 12 ministers appointed, 7 had been ministers in de Kirchner's government, while the other 5 took office for the first time. 3 other ministries were created afterwards. She began a 4-year term on December 10, 2007, facing challenges including inflation, union demands for higher salaries, private investment in key areas, lack of institutional credibility, utility companies demanding authorization to raise charges, low availability of cheap credit to the private sector, and the upcoming negotiation of the defaulted foreign debt with the Paris Club. Kirchner was the second female president of Argentina, after Isabel Martínez de Perón, but, unlike Perón, Kirchner was elected to the office, whereas Isabel Perón was elected as vice president of Juan Perón, and automatically assumed the presidency on his death. The transition from de Kirchner to Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was also the first time a Democratic head of state was replaced by their spouse without the death of either. de Kirchner stayed active in politics despite not being the president, and worked alongside his wife, Cristina. The press developed the term presidential marriage to make reference to both of them at once. Some political analysts as Pablo Mendelevic compared this type of government with a Diorchy presidency. 2007, during the first days of Fernández's presidency, Argentina's relations with the United States deteriorated as a result of allegations made by a United States assistant attorney of illegal campaign contributions, case known as the Maletinazo. According to these allegations, Venezuelan agents tried to pressure Venezuelan-American citizen Guido Antonini Wilson to lie about the origin of $790,550 in cash found in his suitcase on August 4, 2007 at a Buenos Aires airport. U.S. prosecutors allege the money was sent to help Kirchner's presidential campaign. Fernández de Kirchner and Venezuelan President Hugo Chávez called the allegations a trashing operation, and part of a conspiracy orchestrated by the U.S. to divide Latin American nations. On December 19, 2007, she restricted the U.S. ambassador's activities and limited his meetings to foreign ministry officials. A treatment reserved for hostile countries, in the opinion of a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. However, on January 31, in a special meeting with Kirchner, the U.S. ambassador to Argentina, Earl Anthony Wayne, clarified that the allegations were never made by the United States government, and the dispute cooled down. Having said that the prosecutors making the charges are part of the independent judicial branch of the U.S. government. Elisabet and Mara Soro, both high-ranking members of the main opposition parties, have claimed that the Argentine government's response to the allegations and its criticism of the U.S. are a smokescreen, that the U.S. involvement in the affair was merely symptomatic, and the root cause of the scandal is corruption in the Argentine and Venezuelan governments. 2008. The Kirchnerist Front for Victory won the 2007 general elections, and had 153 congressmen and 44 senators, at the time. In March 2008, Kirchner introduced a new sliding-scale taxation system for agricultural exports, effectively raising levies on soybean exports from 35% to 44% at the time of the announcement. This led to a nationwide lockout by farming associations, starting on March 12, with the aim of forcing the government to back down on the new taxation scheme. They were joined on March 25 by thousands of pot-banging demonstrators massed around the Buenos Aires obelisk and in front of the presidential palace. Protests extended across the country. In Buenos Aires, hours after Kirchner attacked farmers for their two-week strike and abundant profits, there were violent incidents between government supporters and opponents, to which the police was accused of willfully turning a blind eye. The media was harshly critical of Luis Leyer, a former government official who took part in the incidents, with some media sources and members of the opposition, claiming he and his followers had disrupted the protest pursuant to the government's orders. On April 1, the government organized a rally during which thousands of pro-government protesters marched through downtown Buenos Aires in support of the bill increasing Argentina's export taxes on the basis of a sliding scale. The large majorities in the Argentine Congress held by the Front for Victory could not ultimately guarantee a legislative blank check. On July 16, 2008, the presidentially sponsored bill met with deadlock, and was ultimately defeated by the tie-breaking negative vote of Vice President Julio Cobos. The controversy cost the FPV 16 congressmen and 4 senators by way of defections. This put an end to the 2008 Argentine government conflict with the agricultural sector, though it cost Cobos influence within the Kirchner's administration. Despite of the cold relation between Cobos and K'ristina since that event, he completed his term as vice president. A poll result published in El País, Spain's most widely circulated daily newspaper, revealed that following the protests, Fernández's approval rating had plummeted from 57.8% at the start of her administration to an unprecedented 23%. Once recovered from the conflict with agrarian interests, Fernández de Kirchner's job approval ratings rose by 30%. Her inflexible handling of the protests and reluctance to review the policies that sparked the protest have led to speculation that her late husband, predecessor in office and leader of the Justicialist party, now copyrights de Kirchner, controlled her administration. The British weekly newspaper The Economist has described the situation as Kirchner paying the price for her husband's pig-headedness. On October 20, 2008, Fernández proposed the transfer of nearly $30 billion in private pension holdings to the Social Security system, a law that was passed by Congress in late November 2008. President Cristina Kirchner is a member of the Council of Women World Leaders, an international network of current and former women presidents and prime ministers whose mission is to mobilize the highest-level women leaders globally for collective action on issues of critical importance to women and equitable development. Fernández de Kirchner was invited to the Summit on Financial Markets and the World Economy in Washington, D.C., on November 15, 2008, by President George W. Bush. During her stay in Washington, she held meetings with Brazilian leader Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Madeleine Albright, Senator Christopher Dodd and Australia's Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd at the Park Hyatt Hotel. She then attended the G20 meeting in London on April 2, 2009, and was seated across from President Obama at the dinner held the night before at 10 Downing Street. Also in 2008, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner vetoed the law of protection of the glaciers, which had been approved almost unanimously in Congress. Critics have stated that the president's attitude would threaten over 75% of the country's water reserves. She has traveled extensively as president, visiting Algeria, Brazil, Cuba, Egypt, France, Libya, Mexico, Qatar, Russia, Spain, UK, US and Venezuela, among other nations. 2009, following the 28 June 2009, midterm elections, the ruling FPV's party list lost its absolute majority in both houses of Congress, shedding a further 24 seats in the lower house and 4 in the Senate. They lost in the 4 most important electoral districts, and among these, the loss was narrow only in the province of Buenos Aires. The FPV obtained a very narrow victory, overall, as a percentage of the national vote, and retained their plurality in Congress, which was reflected in strengthened opposition alliances, notably the center-right Unión Pro, the centrist Civic Coalition and the left-wing Proyecto Sur, when elected candidates in both chambers took office on December 11, 2009. Allegations of impropriety have contributed increasingly to the Kirchners' decline in approval. The couple's own, latest federal financial disclosure in July 2009 revealed an increase in their personal assets by 10 times since copyrights to Kirchner's 2003 inauguration. The increase was partly the product of land deals in eʻlisaβet, a scenic, Santa Cruz province town where the couple had long vacationed and owned property of land and 2 hotels. On October 17, 2009, Fernández de Kirchner proposed the compulsory submission of DNA samples in cases related to the Dirty War, in a move lauded by the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, but excoriated by opposition figures as a political move against kɾisˈtina Media Group chairperson Ernestina Herrera de Noble, who is in litigation over the Noble siblings case and whose previous cordial relations with Kirchnerism had recently soured. Similar motives are alleged by the opposition against the president's media law, which would restrict the number of media licenses per proprietor and allocate a greater share of these to state and NGOs, thereby limiting the influence of kɾisˈtina and the conservative La Nación kŭrden. The president's proposed enactment of mandatory primary elections for all of Argentina's myriad political parties, and for every elected post, was likewise rejected by opposition figures, who charged that these reforms could stymie minor parties and the formation of new ones. Following charges of embezzlement filed by a local attorney, Enrique k'rиш̂ne'r, on October 29, federal judge Norberto Elisabet ordered an accounting expert to investigate the origin of the Kirchners' wealth. Public records show that since their arrival to power in 2003, the declared assets of the Kirchners increased by 572%. A preliminary report on the investigation by the Argentine Anti-Corruption Office established that the official figures provided by the Kirchners don't stack up. The investigation was suspended by Judge Elisabet on December 30, though a week later, k'rиш̂ne'r appealed the ruling. On October 29, 2009, she launched a universal child benefit plan as a way to fight poverty with a goal to reach approximately 5 million children and youths. Since its creation, the program has been lauded for having boosted school attendance rates and reduced poverty among families. 2010. The year began with controversy surrounding the president's order that a $6.7 billion escrow account be opened at the central bank for the purpose of retiring high-interest bonds, whose principal is tied to inflation. The move met with the opposition of central bank president Martín Redrado, who refused to implement it, and following an impasse, he was dismissed by presidential decree on January 7, 2010. Redrado refused to abide by the initial decree removing him from the presidency of the central bank, however, and petitioned for a judicial power to keep him in office. Accordingly, the president enacted another decree for his dismissal, citing misconduct on Redrado's part. The legitimacy of this new decree was questioned as well, as his dismissal would deny Redrado due process. Congress was in recess period at the time, but most of his opposition members considered returning to override the decrees through an extraordinary session. The session became a source of controversy as well. Kirchner considered that, according to the 63rd article of the Constitution, only the president may call for an extraordinary session while the Congress is in recess. Cobos replied instead that all regulations concerning decrees require the immediate advice and consent of Congress, that the body's bylaws allow extraordinary sessions called by any member, and that the commission formed for that purpose functions at all times, even during recess. The planned use of foreign exchange reserves through a necessity and urgency decree was itself questioned by several opposition figures, who argued that such a decree may not meet a threshold of necessity, and urgency required by the Constitution of Argentina for its enactment. Judge Mara Josa Copyright Sarmiento handed down a ruling preventing said use of reserves, and the government reacted by appealing the ruling. President Kirchner defended the policy as a cost-saving maneuver, whereby government bonds paying out 15% interest would be retired from the market. The move, however, also provided numerous vulture funds, a legal argument against the central bank's independence, thus facilitating a judgment lien on January 12 against a central bank account in New York. Judge Sarmiento also annulled the decree that removed Redrado and reinstated him as president of the central bank the following day. The ruling refuted claims of misconduct cited by President Cristina Kirchner to justify his removal. International media described the attempted removal of Redrado as authoritarian, while criticizing the planned use of reserves for debt retirement, as well as accelerating spending growth, as fiscally irresponsible. Opposition Congresswoman Elisabet, a candidate in the 2011 presidential campaign, has raised the possibility of impeachment procedures against Cristina Kirchner. At the start of February 2010, one of Fernández de Kirchner's private assessors resigned his post due to the claims of illicit gain. Just 2 weeks afterwards, another of her private assessors, Julio Daniel Alvarez, resigned for the same reason. On 22 February 2010, February 22, 2010, British oil explorer Desire Petroleum started drilling exploration wells some 60 miles north of the disputed Falkland Islands, despite strong opposition from Argentina, which took the issue to the Latin America and Caribbean Presidents' Summit, where it received unanimous support. According to geological surveys carried out in 1998, there could be 60 billion barrels of oil in the area around the islands, but the initial 2010 drilling produced poor results. As a result, Desire's share price plummeted and the company announced further drilling could begin later in 2010. In March 2010, Fernández de Kirchner made an historic amends trip to Peru, a country with whom relations had been adversely affected following the Carlos Menem administration's illegal sale of weapons to Ecuador in the 1990s. In the same month, Fernández received a visit of U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Buenos Aires, where she received great support for the way her administration was managing its foreign debt and emphasized the positive relationship between the two countries, something which was not reported by local major news media. In April 2010, Chile's new president Sebastián Piñera was received in Buenos Aires on his first foreign tour abroad and reaffirmed the current strong ties between the two countries, after which Cristina Fernández attended the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington, D.C. Afterwards, President Barack Obama thanked Argentina for its role in international stabilization and earthquake relief efforts in Haiti. Back in Buenos Aires, she received the President of Russia Dmitry Medvedev, the first such visit in Argentina's history. 2 days later, the Prime Minister of Vietnam Nguyen Thanh Dao Copyright NG arrived. On April 19, she was invited to the bicentenary of the independence celebrations in Venezuela, where she was the main speaker in front of the National Assembly. She signed 25 trade agreements with Venezuela relating to food, technology and energy. In May 2010, the president traveled to Spain for the European Union and Euro-Latin America and the Caribbean Summit, where she was asked to compare the 2010 European sovereign debt crisis and the 2001 Argentine's default. Back in Buenos Aires, during the Argentina bicentennial celebrations, Cristina Fernández did not participate in the military parade of 5,000 troops on Avenida 9 de Julio, which was considered a gesture of contempt towards the Argentine armed forces. In June 2010, her administration completed the debt swap, clearing 92% of the bad debt left from its sovereign default of 2001. Argentina's external debt now represented 30% of the country's GDP, whilst the central bank foreign reserves reached $49 billion, more than the amount that was available when the decision to pay foreign debt earlier in the year was taken. Also in June 2010, she gave a speech at the International Trade Union Confederation Global Summit, held in Vancouver, Canada, where she asserted many Eurozone countries today have applied the same policies that led Argentina to disaster, stating it's an inescapable responsibility of the government to intervene in the financial system. Later, she traveled to Toronto to attend the G20 summit and spoke against the EU fiscal austerity plans, fearing it would lead to a slowdown in the global economy. French President Nicolas Sarkozy responded by saying that Latin American representatives who reject the adjustments made in the Eurozone do not know the harassment the euro had experienced, that had led several nations to implement strong budget-cutting measures. Cristina Fernández responded he should not challenge somebody just because he does not agree with what they say, and clarified that Argentina is interested in the euro because parts of its reserves are held in euros and that she is sure that Sarkozy does not have even 1 cent in Argentine pesos in his central bank. Later, while addressing the press, she added, "In Latin America we can give lectures about harassment and seizure." She also had a chance to speak with new British PM David Cameron. In July 2010, she traveled to the People's Republic of China with the goal of strengthening the strategic partnership between the two countries. On her return, she signed a bill legalizing same-sex marriage in Argentina. She reaffirmed her policy of debt reduction in announcing to continue to pay foreign debt with central bank foreign reserves which reached a historic record of $51 billion USD in July. In August 2010, Fernández de Kirchner began her Twitter account. She preceded the 39th Mercosur summit at San Juan where the trade bloc agreed to reduce customs fees and signed a free trade deal with Egypt. In September 2010, it was announced that Argentina was elected president of the Group of 77 plus China and prepared to act as a Euro with G20 major economies to which it also belongs. Fernández de Kirchner visited Chile during their bicentenary celebrations. She assisted at the baptism of a Chilean baby, Ana S. Escobar Maldonado, born in the Argentine Air Force Mobile Field Hospital deployed at Curacao after the earthquake. The visit had a high profile in the media because of the possible extradition to Chile of Sergio Apaglaser. She met with President Sebastián Piñera and participated in the festivities at the National Stadium. She confirmed the celebration of the Third Binational Cabinet meeting for next October. On September 30, she hosted the UNESA President's Emergency Summit at Buenos Aires due to the Ecuador crisis. She then began an official visit to Germany the next day in order to participate as a guest of honor at the Frankfurt Book Fair and meet Chancellor Angela Merkel. In October she inaugurated the 3 news agencies World Congress held in Bariloche. This same month, as part of the 2006 civilian nuclear power reactivation program, Fernández de Kirchner reopened the Pilcania uranium enrichment plant, put on hold in the 1990s, due to shortages of natural gas. On the morning of October 27, 2010, Copyrights de Kirchner died from heart failure at José Formentiu Hospital in eʻlisaβet, Santa Cruz Province. 2 coronary operations had been required earlier that year. On February 7, 2010, he had developed problems with his carotid artery and needed surgery. On September 11, additional surgery was necessary because of coronary artery blockage and an angioplasty was performed. Copyrights de Kirchner had a state funeral at the Casa Rosada. Following the death of her husband, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner resumed activities and went to Asia for the G20 Seoul summit. Upon her return, she announced the Paris Club agreed to debt talks without International Monetary Fund intervention as had been proposed by Argentina since 2008. These negotiations settled the last portion of the sovereign debt 2001 crisis remaining after the restructuring of debts in 2005 and 2009. In November she took part in the UNESA summit at Guyana, followed by hosting the 20th Ibero-American Summit at Mar del Plata. 2011. The 2011 year was influenced by the general election in October. The youth organization Campora increased its influence in the government, disputing offices and candidacies with the traditional hierarchies of the Justicialist Party and the CGT. Cristina Fernández chose Daniel Filmus as her candidate for the mayor of Buenos Aires. On June 21, 2011, she announced she would run for a second term as president. A few days later, she announced Armando Baudo would run for vice president on her ticket. She personally chose most of the candidates for deputy in the Congress, favoring members of the Campora. she had highly publicized disagreements with Brazil regarding the trade quotas between the two countries. She also had a major dispute with the United States after seizing an American military airplane, accusing the U.S. of smuggling in undeclared firearms, surveillance equipment, and morphine for ulterior motives. On September 22, she addressed the United Nations. She supported the Palestinian request to be seated in the General Assembly, blamed Iran for the 1994 AMIA bombing, and threatened to cancel flights from Chile to the Falkland Islands in order to advance Argentine claims of sovereignty over the islands. The 2011 election took place in October, and she won with 54.1% of the vote. Second term, 2012. After the electoral victory of 2011, the ruling party regained control over both chambers of Congress. They initiated a period of fiscal reform, which included several tax increases, limits to wage increases, but increases in protectionism and reorganization of state-owned enterprises. Congress passed an anti-terrorism law, criticized for its vague and imprecise terms, that may allow it to be used against political opponents of the government. Hugo Moyano, main union leader, who was a strong supporter of k'r^schnerism, began to oppose the president. Moyano would later organize a big protest at Plaza de Mayo, with 30,000 people, requesting the abolition of capital gains tax. However, her close union ally Enrique Omar Suárez, another powerful union leader, has remained in support of her. The vice president Armando Bauda got involved in a political scandal, suspected of favoring the Sicón currency printing business. The poor maintenance of rail services led to a rail disaster that left 51 dead and 703 injured. The government has also begun to devote more attention to the Falkland Islands sovereignty dispute. Fernández also supported the nationalization of YPF. In 2012, the government tightened currency controls, allowing access to other currencies only to people who traveled outside the country. The blockade of other currencies affected financial activities and led to a black markets in currencies. On May 15, the governor of the Buenos Aires Province Daniel Scioli voiced his intention to run for the presidency in 2015. On July 11, Fernández criticized the administration of the Buenos Aires province because the provincial government didn't have money to pay their workers' wages. The province requested a transfer of funds from the federal government but were initially denied by the president. On July 20, the federal government agreed to transfer funds to the province. Moyano claimed the denial to transfer funds was to harm Scioli's image, as Scioli has the highest rate of approval of any governor in the nation. Several other political scandals came to light in 2012, such as the liberation of sentenced prisoners for government-organized demonstrations, political advocacy of the Campura at elementary and high schools, and the creation of paramilitary units in Judiciary, led by Milagro Sala. More than 200,000 people in many cities of the country took part in a protest against k'r^schne'r in September 2012. The protest was followed by a protest of the Gendarmeria and another of the CTA. The largest demonstration was the 8N, which took place on November 8. The managing director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, warned the k'r^schne'r administration of the need for Argentina to provide the IMF with reliable estimates of inflation and growth. A BBC report noted that, while official government data reported inflation at 10%, private economists estimated the true rate at around 24%. Kirchner rejected Lagarde's demands. Her administration sought to increase bilateral relations with Angola and Iran. Since there is suspected Iranian involvement in the 1994 AMIA bombing, Kirchner's relations with the Argentine Jewish community deteriorated. Fernández gave her United Nations General Assembly speech where she again criticized Britain over the Falklands issue, and Iran for the 1994 AMIA bombing while giving her support for an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue and an eventual Palestinian state. The Argentine Navy training ship ARA Libertad was impounded in Ghana in October 2012 as part of an extended legal battle between Kirchner's administration and holdout holders of Argentine government debt who had refused to accept the earlier write-down of principal and who continued to pursue full payment through the courts. On October 26, New York Judge Thomas Griesa issued a ruling favoring the holdout creditors, and against the government's practice of excluding them from payments made to those bondholders who had participated in the earlier debt restructuring. The government is appealing Griesa's judgment. 2013. Argentina signed an accord with Iran in relation to the Emir bombing. According to it, the Iranian suspects will be interrogated in Iran, under Irani laws. Not all suspects would be interrogated, but only those with a red alert arrest order from Interpol. This accord was rejected by the opposition parties and the Jewish community, who deemed it unconstitutional. Buenos Aires and La Plata suffered floods in April, with more than 70 deaths. Mayor Mauricio Macri pointed that the national government prevents the city from taking international loans, which did not allow for infrastructure improvements. A week later, Kirchner announced an amendment of the Argentine Judiciary. 3 bills were controversial. The first proposes to limit the injunctions against the state, the second to include people selected in national elections at the body that appoints or accuses judges, and the third to create a new court that would limit the number of cases treated by the Supreme Court. The opposition considered that those bills attempt to control the judiciary. The 2013 season of the investigative journalism program Periodismo para Todos revealed an ongoing case of political corruption, named The Root of the K Money, which generated a huge political controversy. Both things led to a huge k'r on April 18, known as the 18A, the largest one to date against President Kirchner. The aforementioned amendment of the judiciary was repealed by the Supreme Court, which ruled the law to be unconstitutional. The Front for Victory is defeated at the October midterm elections, with a sound victory of Sergio Massa at the populous Buenos Aires Province. Still, the government retains the majority in both houses of the Congress. The Supreme Court rules the media law to be constitutional, a pair of days after the election. Cristina Fernández, who was under medical treatment during both events, changed the cabinet at her return, appointing Jorge Capitanic as chief of cabinet, Axel Kicillof as minister of economy, Juan Carlos Fábrega as president of the central bank, and Carlos Casamigla as minister of agriculture. The Interior Trade Secretary Guillermo Moreno resigns the following day. The international controversy over the renationalization of YPF ends with a financial compensation for Repsol. The year ends with several electricity blackouts and with the Argentine Federal Police going on strike at several provinces, which causes looting. 2014, the year began with a renewed economic crisis, which led to a nationwide strike of teachers, and a general strike by union leader Hugo Moyano. The crisis was temporarily solved with a rise of the interest rate. On January 22, Cristina Fernández announced the government-sponsored program Progresa, which gives a monthly subsidy for youths aged 18 to 24 who wish to complete studies but are unemployed or work under the table. Cristina Kirchner visited Pope Francis for a third time. The scandal over Armando Bauda grew when he was summoned for inquiry by federal judge Ariel Lijo. The country paid the debt with a Paris club. U.S. Judge Thomas P. Griesa rules that Argentina must pay as well to the vulture funds that did not enter into the Argentine debt restructuring, which Cristina Kirchner accepts to do to prevent a new sovereign default. Cabinet. On November 14, 2007, the president-elect publicly announced the names of her new cabinet, which was sworn in on December 10. Of the 12 ministers appointed, 7 were already ministers in now copyrights to Kirchner's government, while the other 5 took office for the first time. 3 other ministries were created afterwards. Relationship with the media. In April 2008, Kirchner received a stern public rebuke from several Argentine media owners after having publicly accused cartoonist Hermenegildo Zarbat of behaving like a quasi-gangster. In addition, a government proposal to create a watchdog to monitor racism and discrimination was received with suspicion by Argentine Media Owners Association, who called it a cover attempt to control the media. Now copyrights to Kirchner had received a similar rebuke for publicly and falsely denouncing Joaquin Morales Sola, a journalist critical of the government, for having produced an inflammatory text published in 1978. On September 11, 2009, She advanced the decriminalization of injurious calumny against public officials, a charge which had, in 2000, resulted in a prison term of 1 year for Eduardo Kimmel, a journalist investigating the San Patricio Church massacre of 1976. She drew fire from a highly controversial media law proposed shortly afterwards, however. Defended by the government as a reform intended to fragment ownership of media companies as to encourage plurality of opinion, the bill was criticized by part of the opposition as a means to silence voices critical of the government, especially those in the country's largest media, the kɾis៍group. The law aroused further controversy, given that in its passing through the chambers of the legislature, the mandatory 7-day period between debate and dissent of the new legislation was ignored. Some within the opposition accused Kirchner's government of trying to rush the law through Parliament before December 2009, when the government could have lost its absolute majorities in Congress. In a speech given on September 24, 2009, Lauro Law ±0, the president of ADEPA, opposed the proposed law, and added that in Latin America, especially in Venezuela and Argentina, press freedom was being undermined under the pretext of plurality. Others, notably press freedom advocacy group reporters Sans Frontières, have expressed support for the measure, citing the need to repeal the radio broadcast law of 1980 enacted by the National Reorganization Process, Argentina's last military government. The acrimony between Cristina Kirchner's government and the national media was exacerbated by a series of lock-ins carried out by a truck drivers' union led by Pablo Moyano, son of Hugo Moyano, a close ally of the Kirchner government. During these incidents, the country's most widely circulated newspapers were prevented by force and threats of violence from distributing papers to newsstands. On November 7, 2009, the Association of Newspaper Editors of Buenos Aires issued a statement in which it claimed that the truck drivers' union's actions had been the fiercest attack on the free circulation of newspapers the country had seen since its return to democratic rule in 1983. Ontario, 2010. The Supreme Court of Argentina ruled the judicial movement made by an opposition deputy who tried to suspend the new media law, which was approved by the National Congress, was illegal. On March 2012, Cristina Kirchner claimed that the column written by Osvaldo Pepe on March 12 was very Nazi, also criticizing Carlos Ponai's column for the newspaper La Nación Cubana as having a smell of anti-Semitism. Fernández de Kirchner has given the press opportunity to ask questions only 5 times since 2007. As a reaction to this, several opposition journalists appeared in a TV program in protest, requesting to be able to ask questions in future appearances of Fernández. To avoid press conferences, she makes an extensive use of the emergency population warning to make announcements or criticize other people. The Kirchner's administration announced its intention to require the independent media group to auction off a major segment of its operation in early December 2012, under a 2009 law that bans media companies from owning both print and TV operations, and limits the number of licenses a firm can hold. Named in the media as 7D, the attempt was overruled by the extension of an injunction that protects k'r during the duration of the trial, which would have expired on that day. Net worth. Fernández's net worth increase has been subject to controversy. She claims that her net worth has been influenced by her successful law firm. Fernández's net worth dropped in 2010 because 50% of Kirchner's assets were inherited by his sons after Néstor's death. Her annual income is $72,132 as president, but most of her net worth comes from 2 hotels in Caliphate. It has been reported that hotels in Caliphate are usually empty in winter. The company that manages it is connected to businessman Lázaro Báez, who benefits from public work. Public image. In 2008, she was ranked by Forbes magazine as 13th in the list of the 100 most powerful women in the world, being the second female head of government in the list below Angela Merkel. In 2009 she rose to 11th, but in 2010 she fell to 68th. As of 2014, she is listed as the 19th most influential woman in the world. In 2010, she was ranked by the magazine Time as 4th in the list of the top 10 female leaders of the world. Kirchner often made speeches with images of Eva Pera Cubden in the background, further encouraging comparisons. This is done either at the Hall of the Women of the Bicentennial at the Casa Rosada, which features portraits of notable Argentine women, or at the Ministry of Health building, which has a giant image of Evita. The exact image of Evita used is selected according to the tone of the speech. If it has good news, it will be an image of a benevolent Evita. If it is an attack on someone, it will be an image of an angry Evita. Style: Kirchner is famously passionate about clothes. She wears a mixture of textures, colors and prints, and always wears makeup and high heels. After her husband's death, she wore black attire. According to Perfil Weekly newspaper, she has worn more than 200 different black outfits. In popular culture, Oliver Stone directed the 2009 documentary South of the Border, a film that challenges what it terms the mainstream media's misrepresentation of left-wing Latin American leaders including Cristina Kirchner and her late husband. Copyrights to Kirchner, as well as Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, Raúl Castro, Fernando Lugo and Lula. Footnotes. Notes. Bibliography: Skard, Torild. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Women of Power, Half a Century of Female Presidents and Prime Ministers Worldwide. Bristol, Policy Press. ISBN A9781447315780. Di Marco, Laura. La Campora. Buenos Aires, Sudamericana. ISBN A978-950-07-3798-2. Gelb, Joyce. Leaf Pally, Marion. Women and Politics Around the World. United States, ABC Clio, Incorporated. ISBN A978-85109-988-7. Retrieved June 15, 2014. Mendelovic, Pablo. El Final. Buenos Aires, Editions B. ISBN A978-987-627-166-0. References. External links: Spanish, Office of the President, Spanish, official site of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, Spanish, Senate of the Argentine Republic website, Spanish, extensive biography by CIDOB Foundation, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner at the Notable Names Database, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner at the Internet Movie Database.